You may have noticed that there is an election coming. And our gospel today gives us maybe some things to think about as we approach the election, and something more than just the election itself. But we need to back up a little bit from today's gospel because it is the end of a section in Mark. It's a section that began in our readings back in the very beginning of the fall and has led up to today. And the first thing that happens in this section is that Jesus takes the disciples up north, up into the north, after they have been poking around a little bit in what is modern-day Lebanon, in fact, exactly where the fighting is going on in southern Lebanon right now. After Jesus and the disciples have spent some time there, they start to turn to come back down, but they're still up in the north. Maybe the equivalent for us if they were in, let's say, Hamilton, Ontario. And while they're there, Jesus asks them, because they're sort of away together, kind of a retreat almost. Jesus says, "Who do the people say I am?" And they give some of the answers that people are saying out there, John the Baptist or one of the prophets. But then he turns on them with a critical question, and this is where the turning point, the watershed of this whole gospel happens. Who do you say that I am? And Peter answers, "You are the Messiah." That's Hebrew, Messiah. In Greek, it's Christ. You are the Christ. In English, it would be the Anointed One. You are the Anointed One. You are the agent of God to do on God's behalf what we can't do for ourselves. You're the Anointed One. You're the Christ. You are the Messiah. Everything in this gospel, that's the central before and after point. Everything else leads up to it. Everything else follows from it. This moment when Jesus asks them, "Who do you say I am?" and Peter says, "You are the Messiah." Now, the first thing that Jesus does immediately after that is he starts to say that he is going to have to go to Jerusalem and be betrayed and suffer and die and then rise again from the dead. And Peter immediately pushes back. That just can't be. This is not what a Messiah does. The Messiah should be leading us in conquering the enemy. So as much as Peter got it right when he said you are the Messiah, he got it very wrong, though understandably so, when Jesus tried to teach him what kind of a Messiah he was going to be. Well, now they begin to travel south, and there's various adventures along the way in Galilee, and then comes a moment when Jesus teaches them again the same thing. We had this just a couple weeks ago. I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be betrayed, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, and then I'm going to rise again. Now that time it says the disciples were afraid to ask him what in the world this meant, probably because they saw what happened to Peter last time. Just said they were afraid to ask him. But then they immediately, as they keep walking along, start having an argument amongst themselves about who is the greatest among them. Who's the greatest? So they're obviously not getting this lesson yet. And this is the time, you remember this from a couple weeks ago, when to try to illustrate what he's trying to teach him, Jesus takes a child who were not thought of romantically in those days, but were kind of thought of a nuisance until they grew up. He takes a child and puts them in the midst and says, "This is what I am, this is what I'm about." Some more adventures in Galilee, and then we come up almost to today's gospel. But the people who put together the selections that we read left out the third time that Jesus teaches them about what's going to happen. So I want to read it, because it would have come just before where Deacon Dorothy started. They were on the road, going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed, were afraid. Let's just get that picture in mind. They're getting closer to Jerusalem. Jesus is out ahead of the group. They're amazed at everything that's happening, and they're also afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again." Now, what is the response of the disciples this time? Did they say, "Oh yeah, we finally get it"? No, James and John, the brothers, come up to him and say, "Lord, we want to ask you something." "Okay, what do you want?" "We want to sit on your side when you come into your kingdom, one on one side and one on the other." And something about that makes the rest of the disciples angry and upset. Maybe they were hoping to get their plea in first to be able to sit on his side in his kingdom, but obviously they're still not quite getting this message, and so Jesus pulls them together and he says, "You know that among the Gentiles," which for Jews means everybody else in the world, "you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. For whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." That's his final teaching. The next thing that happens in the gospel is Palm Sunday and Holy Week and the crucifixion and the resurrection. This is what it all comes down to for Jesus' teaching in Mark. He contrasts glory and greatness with servanthood. He contrasts trying to be first with willing to be last. He contrasts people who want to argue about who is the greatest with a child. Several years ago, the president of Princeton Theological Seminary gave a commencement address that is still remembered today, and it was called "They Also Serve Who Lead." They also serve who lead. He was making the point that what Jesus is saying does not mean that nobody should be willing to lead. We all should just be servants and be in the background and do all the little things and leave all of the leadership to someone else. He was saying no, to embrace and accept the responsibility and the authority and position of leadership is a form of service. It's all a question of why are you doing it? What are you serving? Who are you serving in that position? Do you take on the position in order to be a servant for the common good? Or you try to get the power to be a servant of yourself and maybe your friends? Now, I think that is a question we can take to our consideration of our vote. And not just for president, but up and down the line. Do we have people who have demonstrated in their lives that they want to have a public position of leadership so that they can be a servant of the common good? Do they have a track record that shows that? Does what they say show that? I think it's legitimate for us to take those questions into our consideration. And I have a pretty good bet that among us here, we would have different points of view about that. That's fine. I'm just saying take those questions to your consideration. Of course, it's much bigger than that. There's more to it than just electing who we elect. Because every institution, no matter what it is, whether it's the government, education, business, and yes, even the church. Every institution is only as good as the people who are part of it. And every institution, no matter how carefully it's constructed, can be misused by the wrong type of leadership. So it's not just about as if we could vote for something and then that solves all of our problems because we voted somebody in or not. It's a much bigger question. It's about what kind of culture are we building? How are we forming people? How are we educating people? What are we encouraging? Are we wanting people who are able to serve others and see that as something good? Are we doing that in our own lives? Because the reality is that our life together in our culture, in our nation, in the world is dependent upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands of acts of service. Some of them are public and well known. Some of them are only known by a few people. Many of them, nobody ever knows about. That time that somebody sees an obviously exhausted and harassed mom in the grocery store and lets them in the line ahead of them, nobody ever knows about that. But our life together depends upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands of acts of service. And that's what will make the people who, when they come into positions of leadership, be able to be servants. And in what? It actually works. I mean, if we look at our life experience and we think about the people who have really been important to us as leaders, or times that we've been in a position of leadership, the times that it has been more about serving others than trying to gain something for ourselves, there's something about that that is always wonderful and always good. It works. Jesus is right. Let's just come toward the end with a couple of examples from our life here at St. Stephen's. We have this wonderful garden out there. I can see it from here. Most of the rest of you know what I'm talking about. It provides all kinds of fresh vegetables for people who come to the food pantry. It also provides allotments so that people who get food from the food pantry can come here and have the dignity of growing some of their own food. It's a wonderful project. Now imagine if we decided, I think we're just going to use that food for ourselves. We'll grow the garden and we'll all just kind of take some of the vegetables home, and that would be the point. Wouldn't it be just an entirely different kind of thing? And then I think about our experience just 2 weeks ago, when we took, which was a happy and joyful experience of blessing the animals here together on Sunday morning at this service, just like this, and we took it outside the walls. And we had people from the community. Some of them we have no idea who they were, but they showed up with their dog to be blessed. Wasn't that taking something that was good, but making it even better because it was shared with others? It works. It just works. So let's hear again this final teaching of Jesus. You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them, but it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Now, it's obviously central to our faith that something happened when Jesus died and rose again. It's bigger than we can put into any words or hold in any one image, but we try, and we have several out there, and all of them, when we hold them up, illuminate some things, but don't help us with some other things. So one that we heard today was that Jesus, who died and rose again, is now our great high priest forever in heaven, is the great perfect high priest who is both the priest and the sacrifice. But the one that Jesus uses here is that he is a ransom for many. And some other time, because this is not the time to do it, we can have the interesting and finally probably impossible discussion about who is he paying the ransom to. But that's not his point here. The point is the outcome. What happens when a ransom is paid? People are set free. People are free. And what's happening here, Jesus is saying in his death and resurrection, is that we are set free from the prison of the self-centeredness that locks us in to damage relationships with God and ourselves and other people and with the creation. It sets us free from that to begin a life of service.